Ladies and gentlemen, Johnny Cash!
Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I invite you into a story that was never meant to be heard. It's about a voice, raw, cracked, trembling. A voice we all thought we knew. A voice that once stood tall in black, guitar slung low, thundering across prison walls and into American hearts. But this time, that voice didn't sing to the world. It whispered to itself in the dark. For decades, Johnny Cash's family kept it buried. A single recording, unearthed only recently from a locked wooden box, hidden among dust and memories in a Tennessee farmhouse. No label, no explanation. Just Johnny, alone, confessing something so personal, so haunting, it never made it to the public ear. Why was it hidden? What truth did it carry that made his loved ones turn away for years? Tonight, for the first time, we bring that story to light. Not just a story of music, but of guilt, silence, and the weight of a brother's death that never stopped echoing. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to hear was never meant to be heard, but once you do, you'll never forget it. Ladies and gentlemen, to understand the depth of this hidden recording, we must first revisit the man who made it, a man carved into the very soul of American music, Johnny Cash, the Man in Black. A name that conjures up images of rebellion, redemption, and raw honesty. But who was he really? Born in the cotton fields of Kingsland, Arkansas in 1932, Johnny Cash grew up in the shadow of poverty and pain. His earliest lullabies were the sounds of labor, the rhythmic swing of the axe, the hum of the wind across dry soil. Music was not a luxury in his childhood. It was a necessity, a means of survival. And from a young age, that unmistakable baritone voice began forming in the crucible of suffering. When he first stepped into Sun Records in Memphis, alongside Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis, Cash wasn't just another rockabilly hopeful. He brought something darker, something heavier. Folsom Prison Blues wasn't just a song, it was a cry from behind invisible bars. Even though he had never served time, but he understood pain, he understood longing, and the world heard it. By the 1960s, Johnny Cash was no longer just a singer, he was a symbol. To the outcasts, the broken, the addicted, the imprisoned, he was theirs. He stood before prisoners in Folsom and San Quentin, sang to them not as a preacher, but as a fellow sinner. And they listened, because Cash wasn't pretending. But behind the fame, the black clothes, and the storm of applause, there was a man unraveling. Addiction gripped him like a vice, pills to stay awake, pills to sleep, pills to numb what no song could soothe. His marriage to Vivian Liberto collapsed under the weight of it all. And though June Carter would eventually guide him to faith and stability, the scars never truly faded. Yet, despite the chaos, his career soared. Grammys, Hall of Fame inductions, presidential honors, a television show, sold-out concerts across the world. He became not just a country icon, but a moral compass. Flawed, but real. He didn't hide his past. He wore it like his black coats, heavy, but honest. What made Johnny Cash so beloved, ladies and gentlemen, was not perfection. It was his transparency. He sang of murder, regret, grace, and God in the same breath. He told the truth, even when it hurt, even when it humiliated him. And still the world adored him. But there was one truth he never fully shared, a grief so consuming it never made it to the stage, a secret that followed him from the moment he was 12 years old, the day his brother Jack died, the day everything changed. His fans knew about Jack in fragments. He'd mention him in interviews, in quiet lines within gospel songs. But the full weight of that loss, the guilt Johnny carried, the questions that haunted him, were things he reserved for himself. Or so we thought. Until now. Because the buried recording wasn't just a forgotten song, it was a confession. An intimate message left behind like a prayer trapped on tape. And ladies and gentlemen, it is there, between the chords, between the breaths, that the real Johnny Cash emerges.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was nothing more than an unmarked reel, aged, dusty, the kind of thing one might toss aside during spring cleaning. But for John Carter Cash, it was a time capsule. Nestled deep within the family's Hendersonville estate, beneath layers of forgotten belongings, he found it, a lone recording. No notes, no context, only the voice of his father, stripped of production, void of audience, raw as a wound left open for decades. At first, he thought it might be a demo, perhaps an unreleased gospel track, or a song that didn't make the final cut of American 4. But as the tape played, what emerged wasn't a performance. It was something far more fragile. It was Johnny Cash talking like a man alone in the dark with God. The guitar was there, yes, but it was barely strummed. What dominated was his voice, shaky, breathless, confessional. The words weren't poetic. They weren't meant to be. They were jagged, uncomfortable. I watched him fall, and I prayed he'd get up, but I didn't run. A silence followed, long, heavy. Then a single sentence, spoken almost as a whisper. He died, and I lived, and I've never understood why. Ladies and gentlemen, those were not lyrics, that was testimony. For years, fans had pieced together the tragedy of Jack Cash's death. Jack was only 14. He'd been sawing fence posts at a local mill when the blade slipped. The injury was catastrophic. He suffered for over a week before passing away. Yanni, just 12 at the time, was said to have begged his mother to let him stay with Jack in the hospital. He kept vigil at the boy's bedside, praying and singing hymns. But what no one knew until this recording was the magnitude of Johnny's guilt, that he'd been the one to suggest Jack work that day, that he might have delayed help by not alerting their father sooner, that every accolade, every ovation, every encore was a hollow victory, shadowed by the feeling that he should have died instead. The family had always protected this wound. His mother, Carrie, believed Jack was destined to be a preacher, the chosen son. Johnny, he was the troublemaker, the wild one. And when Jack died, that grief became a crucible, burning, transforming, and ultimately forging the Johnny Cash the world would come to know. But trauma doesn't simply shape, it buries. For decades, Cash wrote about redemption. He toured prisons, counseled addicts, recorded gospel after gospel. But even in his most spiritual moments, he never directly addressed that day. Until this tape. Why was it recorded? No one knows. Perhaps it was a private therapy session, never meant to surface. Or maybe it was meant as a message to Jack, to God, or to himself. A final reckoning before the end. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this recording was likely made not long before his death in 2003. You can hear it in his voice, the tremble of age, the breathlessness of a heart worn thin. But there's something else too, a peace, or perhaps the pursuit of it. When John Carter heard it, he didn't speak. He simply cried. It was Dad, not singing, not preaching, just being. And I don't think he ever did that in front of anyone. It is a father's ghost, a brother's lament, a confession carved into magnetic tape, and it shattered everything the family thought they had buried. Ladies and gentlemen, imagine carrying a wound for 70 years, a wound so deep, so formative that it seeps into every song you write, every stage you walk, every prayer you whisper. That was Johnny Cash's burden. But unlike his demons of addiction or public scandal, this wound had no headlines, no arrest records, no rehab stints, just silence, generations of it. And that silence, once unearthed in the form of that ghostly recording, was deafening. When word of the tape spread within the family, it didn't bring relief, it brought conflict. Some members, especially those closest to Johnny's gospel legacy, feared the recording would tarnish his image. Dad had made peace with God, one relative argued. This tape, it feels like reopening a grave. Others, like John Carter, felt it was the only thing that ever told the full truth. In the recording, Johnny speaks of the day Jack died with chilling detail. He says he slipped, but I still hear the scream. Mama blamed herself. Daddy blamed me. Then a pause. I blamed God. It was the first time anyone had heard him say it out loud. That line alone ignited shockwaves. For decades, Johnny Cash had been the poster child of redemption. He recorded entire albums of gospel music. He read the Bible daily. He was baptized again late in life, even recorded readings of the New Testament. And now, to hear him whisper, "I blamed God," it was as if the foundation cracked.
Church leaders who had long held him as a symbol of faith urged the family not to release the tape. "People aren't ready to hear this," they warned. "It could shake faith more than it strengthens it." But was that really what Johnny feared? Or was he simply being honest, for once, without worrying about the public? Throughout his life, Johnny had offered the world pieces of the truth, filtered through melody, metaphor, or performance. Hurt, his cover of the Nine Inch Nails song, was widely interpreted as his final cry of pain and repentance. The music video, showing a trembling Cash intercut with decaying symbols of wealth and glory, brought even hardened critics to tears. But even then, he hadn't spoken this truth. And so the family was torn. June Carter Cash, had she been alive, may have chosen differently. She was known to be fiercely protective of Johnny's soul, his public image, and their legacy. But in her absence, John Carter stood alone with a decision that would shape how the world remembered his father. The tape revealed something else, too, a spiritual exhaustion. Johnny says at one point, "I've forgiven everyone, but I've never forgiven that boy for dying." His voice breaks, then silence. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the sound of a man collapsing into his own memory. Not with rage, not with self-pity, but with surrender, with a brokenness too deep for applause to reach. The reactions among friends and colleagues were mixed. Chris Christopherson reportedly wept after hearing the tape, saying, "That's not a song, that's a soul talking." Others, like Rick Rubin, Cash's final producer, believed the world needed to hear it. "Johnny spent his life bridging heaven and hell," Rubin said. "This tape, it's the no man's land in between." And in that no man's land, ladies and gentlemen, is where Johnny Cash truly lived. Ladies and gentlemen, after months of soul-searching, quiet meetings, and family debates behind closed doors, the decision was made. The recording, unfiltered, unedited, unembellished, was released. Not with a press tour, not with marketing fanfare or commercial ambition, It was quietly aired one evening on a special memorial broadcast hosted by John Carter Cash himself. He sat before the mic, eyes dim, voice trembling, and introduced the tape not as a producer, not even as a son, but as a man who simply wanted the world to understand the truth his father had carried alone. And when the tape played, the world fell silent. Across living rooms, car radios, country stations, and streaming platforms, millions heard it. That single take recording, the barely tuned guitar, the words that wavered between prayer and confession. People wept, not because of the melody, but because of the unbearable closeness. Johnny was no longer the man in black towering over a stage. He was a boy, still standing in that sawmill, still frozen in grief, still calling out for his brother, still asking God why he had lived. And somehow, that made him more human than ever. Letters flooded in, fans who had lost siblings, veterans carrying guilt from wars, mothers who outlived their children, ministers, atheists, addicts, survivors. They all said the same thing. He spoke the words I couldn't. That recording, ladies and gentlemen, did not break Johnny's legacy. It completed it. Because in the end, what Johnny Cash had always offered wasn't perfection, but pain transformed into poetry. He never claimed to be righteous. He only ever wanted to be real.
And perhaps that tape, that whispered confession, was his final act of grace. Not a song meant for charts, but a moment meant for release, for letting go of the one ghost he never dared face in public. Until then. John Carter later said, "When I heard that tape, I realized Dad didn't want it buried. He wanted someone to witness it, not to judge it, not even to explain it, just to hear him." And so we did. Ladies and gentlemen, in the final years of his life, Johnny Cash gave us albums full of wisdom, sorrow, and salvation. But in that lost recording, he gave us something else entirely. His silence finally breaking. Ladies and gentlemen, when a legend bears his soul, not on stage, not in a studio, but in solitude, what are we meant to do with that? Do we honor the silence he kept? Or do we find meaning in the pain he left behind? Johnny Cash was no stranger to confession. He confessed in chords, in lyrics, in liner notes and liner scars. But what he whispered into that forgotten recorder was never meant to be sold, studied, or praised. It was meant to be heard, and perhaps to be felt. So now I turn to you. What do we do when the heroes we revere reveal their deepest cracks? Can a man spend a lifetime singing about grace and still admit he never found it for himself? Is forgiveness something we ever truly give, or just something we chase until the very end? And most of all, is it possible, ladies and gentlemen, to live a life so loud, so legendary, and still die haunted by the cry of a brother you couldn't save? Johnny Cash once said, "You build on failure. You use it as a stepping stone. Close the door on the past, but don't forget what's behind it." Tonight, we opened a door that had been closed for decades. And behind it, we didn't find shame. We found truth. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen, because sometimes that's all a broken voice ever needed.